So I don't know. I guess where to start. I first came familiar with your work when I had watched your presentation on American Grand Strategy that you had done, and it was just something I stumbled across on YouTube, and I guess we'll use that as a jumping off point. So you had originally recorded that lecture in about 2010. And over the last decade, how do you think the American grand strategy has changed in your mind?
Well, I think a lot of the basic principles have remained the same, but the implementation has certainly become more complicated as the domestic political environment and domestic economic environment have changed. Uh, we as a nation have slid deeper and deeper into more intense partisanship. And part of what kind of made American grand strategy go for a long time was while there were certainly partisan differences, right and left, Republican, Democrat, on certain key issues, there always was sort of a base of consensus that people would go back to. So it was as if there was kind of an unspoken agreement that partisanship would go so far and no further. There was agreement on the core principles in terms of America's role in the world and so forth. Now I think that's a lot more fragile than it was before, and we've reached a point where almost everything is kind of caught up in hyper partisanship, and everyone takes a position on grand strategy that's deliberately aimed at simply doing the opposite of whatever the other side of the political spectrum wants to do.
Right, right. Well, yeah. I mean, it seems like everything is done more for political theater than actual, legislative strategy these days. And the one thing that you do say in that presentation is that American strategy comes from the political consensus because it's through that consensus that we determine our values and determine what is that purpose of American power. So, and it seems that both those parties they are radically redefining what that purpose should be based on their political ideology. So, what do you think? I guess is the main driving point of this divide.
Well, I mean, the United States has gone through several points in its history where we had where whatever consensus had existed before had kind of become obsolete, and we had to kind of rethink how we saw ourselves in the world, how we defined our security, and so forth. We certainly had one like that. One of these episodes of redefinition during and at the end of World War II, at the beginning of the Cold War, when the United States decided that its security was in a global economic, political, and security system that was rules based, that limited armed conflict as much as possible. At the end of the Cold War, we seem to have gravitated toward the idea that America's role in the world was to be was primacy is the word that's often used, that we had won the Cold War, and now it was up to us to kind of guarantee and police and reinforce this what we saw as a rules based order. That began to fall apart after 9/11, when we kind of shifted from viewing the international system to viewing the specific security of the United States. But in terms of where we are politically now, I think that there are a couple of kind of big issues that are on the table in a way that they really haven't been for decades. One is this question of whether the United States, it's in the United States' interest, and it should be one of our priorities, to pursue primacy and to actually be the guarantor of a global rules-based system. I mean, there are a lot of people today saying, that made sense during the Cold War, might have even made sense in the post-Cold War era. But now, as we're seeing kind of the rise of other powers, we're seeing demands within the United States for resources and so forth, that the United States should take a more restrained role. So, I think if I had to describe what I think is the biggest kind of issue or question today, is whether the United States still should pursue global leadership, a form of primacy, or whether the U.S. should return to kind of a pre-World War II, pre-World War I sort of more restrained role, where perhaps we are the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, but not necessarily globally.
Right, right. Well, I mean, I can see both sides of that argument because I feel like a large portion of the electorate, primarily on the conservative side, have just had battle fatigue for so long, due to Afghanistan, Iraq, just a Middle East presence in general to keep stability in the area. And I mean, it has been a consensus, at least for the American people, that, the you know the wars themselves need to come to an end. People have been saying that for a while, and it's slowly like trickled its way up through Washington, to the point that now we're starting to pull out. But I mean, even with the pullout as an example, once we're gone from that area, you're going to see both the Taliban and other regional forces start to fill that power vacuum. So I wonder, and I guess the downside to that same point is that, if the U.S. does withdraw from a leadership position in the world, that's just going to create a power vacuum for state actors, that may not have the same value set that we do, especially around human rights and individual freedoms.
Yeah, that's certainly a problem. But I think what's taking place now is people are really examining kind of, what I call the core logic of American strategy in a way they haven't for a long period of time. If you go back and look at like the national security strategy documents of the 1990s, it really articulated why it was in the U.S.'s interest to sustain this global leadership or primacy, depending on how you wanted to phrase it. And the primary rationale for that was globalization, global connectivity. I mean, you go back and look at the strategy documents of the 90s, and they very explicitly say, listen, we're concerned with what happens everywhere in the Middle East and Central Asia and South Asia or whatever, because conflict there, economic problems or whatever will eventually resonate back to the United States. So the argument was made that while people in the American heartland might not really understand it, what happens around the world really influences their own economic prospects and things like that. So that was kind of the core logic, that what mattered, what happened everywhere mattered to us. Therefore, we developed a kind of power projection military to try to encourage stability everywhere. But I think what's happening today is that technology, in a lot of ways, is undercutting the logic of that. I mean, I've been predicting for the past year and a half now that one of the results of the COVID pandemic is that we're going to see kind of supply chains and manufacturing move more back to the location where things are made. Something that's always struck me and kind of rattles around my brain is right now, just a few feet from me in my dining room, is I've got a big oak dining room table there, chairs, and this was all made in China. And I said, okay, so I guess it made economic sense at some point in time for oak trees to be cut down, probably in Canada, North America, to be shipped to China, to be manufactured, in their furniture, to be shipped back across the ocean, to put on a truck to go to my local furniture store. So I mean, that made economic sense, in the 1990s previously. But I think we're reaching a point where we're beginning to say, for a whole variety of reasons, does it really makes sense to have that level of global connectivity? I think technology is going to give us the ability to move more economic activity closer to the source where it's used. And the way I phrase that is I think that a lot of nations, not only the United States, but other nations as well, are going to begin to say that they're willing to sacrifice some degree of economic efficiency for greater economic resiliency. In other words, if I have to pay, $20 more for an oak dining room table that's made 50 miles down the road, that might make more sense than getting the cheapest one possible that has to be shipped across the nation. So if this whole economic logic of America's grand strategy changes, then I think Americans got to sit down and say, well, do we really need this massive expeditionary military? Do we really need to be concerned with trying to maintain stability everywhere in the world if we have greater economic resiliency and some degree of deglobalization?